Hey everyone, and welcome to our quick flow snippet video. Unfortunately, we didn't get to do it in a session today, so we thought it would be good to record these videos afterwards to talk everyone through just simple versions of a flow and how you can go about building those. So in this use case here, I'm going to do a record triggered flow, and my purpose is going to be to update an account when a case is created or updated. So if we're creating a brand new case, we want to tick a flag on the account that says that there's an open case. If a case is closed, we then want to check if there's any other open cases. And if there's not, we're going to then untick the open cases checkbox. So there's a couple of different things that we want to do here to run through our thought process and planning out before we go about building this flow. The first of which is deciding how we want it to trigger, as it's going to be that record triggered flow. So we're going to trigger it from the creation or update of a case where the account ID is not null. So obviously we can't update the account if there is no account. So that's an important criteria that we want. I then want to decide two things because I'm triggering on an update and I have my two clearly defined actions about if it was created, checking the box, and if it's closed, unchecking the box. So the first step I want is to then have a decision to see if the case was closed or if it was a new or an opened one. If the case is closed, I then want to find and see if the account I've selected has any other open cases, then have another decision. If there are open cases, then we don't do anything because there's still open cases for that checkbox. If there aren't though, we then want to untick the open case checkbox. If the case is not closed and has simply been created or changed, then we want a decision to check if the flag is already set on the record because we don't want to be making unnecessary updates to the record. If the flag is already set, we're just going to leave the flow and not proceed. If the flag is not set, we're going to set it to true. So with that, we're going to jump in and take a look at the flow that was created for this. So here is the flow that we've gone through. Now this is pre-built and we are going to start talking you through what this looks like. So as you can see, it is a record triggered flow. It was created, I think yesterday, maybe. But the object is on case because we want it to be when the case is created or updated. As I said before, we want it to go through either for a new one or if we update it to closed. And the entry conditions that we want for this, as we mentioned, is account ID on the case is not null. So for this one, the operator, rather than saying does not equal empty string or equals like blah, we can use this is null function, which is saying is it null, and then we can either set some of those global variables that we talked about in a session, so global constants, to either true or false. So for this, we're going to say where the account ID is null, no. So it's not null. We then want to determine when to run the flow for records. So we can either choose it every time a record is created or updated, or only when it's updated to meet the condition requirements. Now, because we want this to run when it's created and when it's closed, we don't want this to only run when it's updated to not be blank because it wouldn't trigger for subsequent updates. So we are going to leave it every time a record is updated. And then we can choose how we optimize this flow. So this fast field updates runs on the record that triggers it and runs before save. Because we want to update the account record that's related to this case and not the case itself, we need to do this action and related records so that it runs after save, and then we can make some of those additional changes so that the values that we want are available. So that's going to be our starting criteria, and we are going to run it straight away. So we're not going to bother putting any scheduled paths in. We want it to run the moment the case is created or edited. Now I'm using the auto layout beta, which means if I want to add in any new steps, I would do so by clicking the plus button wherever I want to add those in. And all of my resources are available in the manager down the left-hand side. If I was going to be using the freeform layout, the manager tab would move and I would have an elements tab here where I could drag and drop these extra elements onto the page. So moving on with our flow, I'm going to sort of talk through the design process here. So the first thing that we have here is a get record. And what I want to do here is get the account record related to the case. Now, I could just perform updates and do update actions and say update account where the ID is equal to account ID. But we want to do this in such a way so that it's performing updates in bulk. And I'll talk through why we did that later. So the first step we're going to do is a get elements and to get the account record. So here we can see I've got my get cases account record. I'm going to get the object account where the ID is equal to the account ID on the triggering record. So when you do a record triggered flow, you have this record variable available to you as a global variable. So we simply select the case that triggered it, and we want the account from that case. Now this will only ever get back one field because it's one lookup. However, we can just say only the first record or all records, regardless, it's going to be the same. The only thing is if we make this all records, it could potentially turn it into a collection variable that we don't want. And we do want to automatically store all of the fields because we want to make some updates to it later. If we didn't, I could choose the fields that I want and let Salesforce do the rest, or I could assign those to some variables. But now we just want to store the whole record and only the first one. So then after, we make that decision point that we talked about there. So here we can come through into our decision, and the first thing I'm doing is checking if the case is open or closed. If the case is closed, then we can say, oh look, I've built this the wrong way around, so we have to troubleshoot it at the same time. If closed, so again, the record that triggered it, the closed, is equal to true, then this is closed. I think I made it false because I was going to work out what was going on here. So the record is closed and that's true. So the closed checkbox is checked, which is something that automatically happens when you close a case regardless of what status it's in. We then want to go down the closed path. Now for this one, I only really want it to run when the case is closed the first time. I don't want to run it every time it's closed. And we want to run it that only if the record that triggered the flow is updated to meet the conditions. So only when it's updated to be closed do we want this to go through. And then we have our default path, which is open. Because this is an order of execution, we can always assume that if it's not closed, it must be open. So that's our closed and our open. So dependent on what path we want to go down then, we're going to decide what we want to do with it. So over here, if it is closed, what we then want to do is to get any open cases that might be on that account. So this is to see if there are any other open cases, which will determine if we need to uncheck the open cases checkbox or not. So this get records element, if we jump in and take a look at it, we want to get all cases where the account ID is equal to the account of the triggering case. We could have also used the account in our get element as well. And we only want to find those cases if they're not closed. So the is closed, which is that checkbox that gets checked automatically, is equal to false. Because we don't really care about all of these, like we really could just get the first record, because even if there's one, we want to know. I'm just going to get all records here though and automatically store all fields for those records, even though we're not going to be using them later on. So then after that, we have an additional decision to say, are there other open cases or not? So if we come into that decision here, other open cases, we can see that I've just got one outcome and the default, because again, we can assume that if there are no other open cases, then there must be open cases. So for this one here, again, we're going to say our resource, so where we've gotten cases or we've gotten the accounts open cases, we can then use that is null criteria again to see if that list is populated or not. This wouldn't work with the not equal to or equals criteria because I think it's a collection, and we just want to evaluate if there's anything stored in that or if it's found or not. So we're going to do that collection variable and we're going to say is null is true. So if it hasn't returned any variables, then we're going to say there's no open cases. Here we're going to do it if the condition requirement is met because there's no update being performed here, so nothing triggered to actually do it. And then again, as I said, if there's no other open cases, then there must be other open cases, so we can then set our default here. Before I move on to what's happened here, we're going to go down the right path and just sort of talk about what happens if the case is open. So if the case is open, we're going to make that decision point here to then check if the open cases flag on the account is already set. Again, nice and easy. We've got one option, and if that one option is not true, then it must be the default. So we're evaluating if the open cases flag is already set or not. So to do that, we're going to use that account record that we found in the get. So we can say that account that we grabbed earlier on, we want to check what their open cases flag is. Now this is a Boolean, so I'm going to say if the open cases flag is equal to false. So again, if it's not false, it must be true. Because there's, again, no updates being performed to the account at this point, we just want to say if the conditions are met at any point. Now, the next step we have on both of these may be a little different to what you're used to. So there's two options that we could go about doing this. What we could do here is simply just do an update record element in both of these places and say, well, if there's no other cases, update record and make the flag false. Or update record and make the flag true. Now, I've gone against this because we wanted to talk through the reasoning why you would do something like this. With these particular options and using assignments, you can actually make multiple changes to a record throughout and only perform one big update at the end, depending on which path it has gone down. Now, it's not necessarily so relevant for this particular flow because it's just making one update here and one update here. But imagine if you had a number of other decision points throughout here, and then based on, other decisions, they were doing more updates, and then other decisions, there were more updates. If you have an update record element at each of those decision points through here, by the time your flow has finished, your record could have been updated 5 or 6 times. Now, if you've got anything that triggers, let's say, before save triggers or after save triggers each time, these could potentially be triggering each time on the way through because you're actually making multiple updates to that record. Now, they could be in a relatively close time frame, so we might not notice. But for example, if you're using a screen flow and it takes the user 10 minutes to complete, and they make one update at 2 minutes, one update at 3, one update at 5, so on and so forth, you're then performing multiple updates to a record across a 10-minute period, which could have different consequences depending on what other automations you have firing. So what we're actually going to do here is to use an assignment to prepare our account record for update. And then at the end, we're going to just update that account record with all of the updates we want to apply to it. Again, it will only update using what's above it, so the path that it's made. So if we go down here, even though this one is setting the account flag to false and this one's setting it to true, it'll only ever do one of these updates at a time. So it'll either, if it's come from here, carry a true value, or if it's come from this path, carry a false value. So what do these assignments look like and why are we using them? I'm only going to talk to one of them because they're pretty much exactly the same internally. So all we're doing here is editing our assignment, and we're just going to set that flag value. So we're going to say, again, that account that we're using, so the account that we found in get cases account, we then want to set the open cases flag to false. For this one here, we're doing the exact same thing and setting it to true. These variables are now set, which means when our update action is performed, we're ready to set the account flag to either true or false. Again, like I mentioned, if I had other decisions and I want to make more updates to the account, they could happen all the way down here, and I just keep going, adding extra assignments to it. And then right at the end of our flow, we're then going to update our account records. So depending on what path it's come down, that's what we want to update. So what does this particular element look like? Because I'm in freeform, I have to drag down to edit. But all we're then saying here is we want to update the account record and we want to use the IDs specified in a record or a record collection. Now, all we then have to do here is then say, I want to update the account from get cases account record, because we've made the updates to the variables on it. We then just want to push those updates based on the assignment. Now, if I didn't do this particular action, and let's say I did use the update elements in each of these here, what that would more so need to look like is I'd have to go through, specify my conditions, say I want to update the account, where the ID is either equal to the account ID on the record, or it's equal to the account ID from the get there, one of those two options. I then have to go through and say, okay, open cases flag is false, or open cases flag is true. And then I'd have to build out two of those rather than just saying, use the variables that were assigned or set further up in here. So this is then preventing sort of multiple DML updates. It's preventing you from updating the records multiple times. And it's really just making it one nice clean update at the end. This is the same premise on if you wanted to process something in a loop. So if you had a loop in here, and let's say you were making an update to the record at the given time, you can go through, you prepare it, it then processes onto the next record, prepares it for update, next record prepares it for update, and then right at the end, you want to update all records at once. You then just pop in the record collection and it's all ready to go. So it just makes it cleaner, really. And that is the update account flag flow that we've configured. So heading back to our side, a couple of things to note here is that decisions are always good to ensure the record updates are not being made unnecessarily and locking the record unnecessarily. So when we talk to that decision to see if the open cases flag was already set, the last thing you want to do is edit it and set it to true again and making unnecessary updates to lock that record. So if you do want to make an update to a record that's specific, maybe evaluate if that record needs to be updated or not prior to actually making that update. With decisions here, so for example, if you want decisions to be made on other objects, you must make it after the trigger criteria, as the triggering criteria can only access fields from the case. So like I said before, if we wanted to check the account flag, we have to do that after the fact because it's not available on the triggering object. And a personal favorite of mine is always try to name your default outcomes. By default, default outcomes and decisions are always called default outcome, which again, like I said, there's always a reasonable assumption that if it's not one of the other options, it's something else. Put in the name of that something else so that if someone's trying to go through and troubleshoot your flow, they know what's happening. So we can see here, if there's no other open cases, then there must be other open cases. If we didn't rename this, it would be no other open cases default outcome. Now, if you've got multiple outcomes, you don't know what that other outcome might be. So it's really hard when it is just called default outcome. You've got to go through all of the criteria that entered it to work out what it couldn't be. So always help your future administrators out and name your default outcome. And it's always important to note that record-triggered flows, much like workflows and process builders, run each time a record is created or edited to see if that criteria is met and does contribute to save times. So if you're making your decisions and not setting, a limiting criteria at the first section, it will run every time it's saved to see if it needs to make an update throughout. So the more you can limit it for the record-triggered part, the better. just to make sure it's not going through and evaluating and contributing to your save times. Thank you, everyone. That's been creating a simple record triggered flow with Ladies Be Architects. If you've got questions, feel free to email me. I'm Adrienne at ladies-be-architects.com, or hit me up on Twitter or LinkedIn or anything else. Thank you, everyone, and have a great day.